Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Coming up in today's program, a weekend of talks in Florida between officials from the Trump administration and negotiators from Ukraine sets the stage for talks later this week in Moscow between US envoys and President Putin with the goal of ending the war in Ukraine. We ask what might be achieved during this pivotal week. Hello and welcome to the programme. We start with the war in Ukraine, where efforts to end the nearly 4-year-long conflict are still underway. The US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is going to head to Moscow tomorrow for talks with President Vladimir Putin as part of a renewed push for peace. Well, President Donald Trump, for his part, says the talks have run into what he called corruption, but he said he is still optimistic there's a good chance that a deal can be struck. Well, his remarks came after talks between US and Ukrainian delegations over the weekend in Florida.
And they're going along well. We want to stop people from being killed. Last month, we had 27,000 people killed in that ridiculous war that should have never happened. Well, we have a corruption situation going on, which is not helpful.
And is that impeding the peace talks?
Well, I said it was going on for 3 years, right? Didn't I say it? For 3 years I said it, so I was way ahead of schedule. But I think that there's a good chance we can make a deal.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy arrived at the Elysee Palace in Paris earlier on today for talks with his French counterpart, President Emmanuel Macron. Well, this week has been described as a pivotal week for Ukraine and the diplomatic efforts to end the war. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to journalist Harold Hyman, who joins us now from Paris. Harold, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. President Zelenskyy is, of course, where you are in Paris today. He's been holding talks with President Macron. And on the one hand, we're hearing some European leaders sounding slightly excluded about not being part of certain key US talks. And on the other hand, I'm wondering how the Americans view talks between Zelenskyy and the Europeans. Do they find these sorts of talks complementary to or somehow obstructive to the US efforts?
It's exactly in between. There's a bit of a feeling, and this is what my French sources say, that in Washington, they're attempting to do their own thing, but they've given up on the idea of not bringing in the Europeans. So they sort of advance and then check what the Europeans are doing and see what they can take out of it, and then repackage their offer and continue like this. And the Europeans are getting quite good at playing this back and forth game because they chose early on not to face Donald Trump head on. If he decides to play solo, they say he is doing something very valuable and we will all confer afterwards. And this is working.
Do you think some in Europe are slightly confused about the approach taken to this issue and this sort of sometimes hot, sometimes cold approach he seems to have to Europe and its leaders on this particular issue?
Well, they're used to it, and they recognize one thing, is that Donald Trump has moved the goalposts. He's moved the goalposts, and this they were not able to do. And Biden was, in a sense, too much like them without being energetic enough. And Trump now is completely unlike them with their diplomatic traditions, but is willing to, tip over the game, the chess game. So they're taking advantage of the dynamism and trying to re-inject traditional diplomatic concepts like what is sovereignty and what is freedom of navigation, and shall we have a scenario of war trials after the war is over, which is a demand coming out of Kyiv. So they have become very expert at balancing this, but They have understood that Trump is one person, Rubio is a second, Witkoff is a third, and Hegseth is a fourth, and Jared Kushner is close to Witkoff. And with this sort of balancing act, they sort of see where the ball is going on this mini golf course and try to snatch the best situation and make it easier for Zelenskyy to demand things without insulting Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's tough, isn't it? Because you've got all these players on the US side, and you've mentioned them there, Rubio, Witkoff, Driscoll, Kushner, until recently Kellogg, many voices, some of them quite inexperienced when it comes to international statesmanship. And on the other side of the table, you've got this one consistent, seasoned voice and set of opinions. I mean, you've got Kirill Dmitriev / Vladimir Putin, I mean, absolutely in lockstep. And I'm wondering whether the Europeans find it slightly worrying that, you know, there are mixed messages on the allied side, so on the European and US side, and very clear messages on the other side, and a mismatch, it would appear, in skill sets.
Well, I would say that the messages coming out of Moscow are not 100% clear. Putin speaks, and then Dmitriev meets with Witkoff, and there seems to be a dynamism which is not reflected by Putin himself. This may be a plan of the Russian side, but it forces everyone to calculate all the time. Now, on the American side, yes, this relative cacophony might actually be useful, because once again, the impression I get from the presidential palace here in France is that things were stuck and Trump unstuck them, but now we have to rein in the animal, so to speak, the animal of negotiations, so that it doesn't go everywhere, but it is free to move. And they're very happy about this. Plus, they're counting the square inches on the ground. So long as the Ukrainian army does not cede too much ground in the Donbass, there is a better bargaining position. And of course, the Russian side is just showering Ukraine with bombs in all directions, very heavily on Kyiv and Dnipro, hitting so many civilians that this is hardening the European side, and even slightly hardening, or if you like, exasperating the American side, who would like things to go faster. Now, to go faster, do you push Zelenskyy into conceding more, or do you up the ante with Putin? This is the game which the Europeans wish they understood, and which Trump is playing, and Trump being very spontaneous while he's being very calculating on the long term. He knows he wants this war to end and money to be made on all sides, starting with the American side. Well, they just are redefining this skill.
Do you think a lot of people in Europe are worried about this sort of pushing for a quick deal in the fear that it's not going to be a very good deal, and it will be a deal that doesn't really have a long-lasting effect? Do you think that's something that European leaders are perhaps cautioning President Trump about?
Well, there you have one of the major points, is that they are worried that this will weaken their side. So they wonder every day whether the Ukrainian army can hold, which is why they've made these almost intangible promises to Ukraine. That France has promised to sell 100 Rafale jet fighters, but they won't see Ukraine for another year and a half. So Ukraine will still have to use the older model of French warplanes, which are Mirages, plus F-16s, plus Gripens, plus whatever they could get their hands on, plus their old Sukhois, which they've semi-hidden. So we're promising things to signal, we, the European side, are promising things to Ukraine to show Russia that this will not be a pushover game. But it's dangerous because, and really there is no other way that I can see, but it's still dangerous because it signals at the same time that Ukraine does not have enough planes and so forth. And the French are trying to give the biggest missiles they have, but we all in the NATO alliance have discovered how underarmed we were for this sort of war. And this is almost a reverse effect because Putin always said that NATO was a formidable thing and it had to be stopped. But it is not in its present configuration that formidable when it comes to Ukraine.
Now, Harold, I know you're in Paris, but let me draw on your knowledge of US politics, because certain comments from senior Republicans can be interpreted as showing some signs of cracks in the resolve of people in the GOP, people in President Trump's inner sanctum with regards to the approach. And a couple of the comments that I've picked out, Senator Mitch McConnell last week quite scathing about the effort, saying the United States is trying to be a neutral arbiter, which of course it is not. And then at the weekend, Representative Mike Turner of Ohio expressing concern that the plan is too pro-Russian and says you can't be America first and pro-Russian because Russia is a self-declared adversary of the United States. I'm wondering how significant you think these kind of voices are, and do you think there really are some quite serious splits in the ranks of the GOP in terms of the right approach to this issue?
There are splits in the GOP, that's quite sure. And the Europeans have chosen not to pay too much attention to them. It is Trump who must pay attention to them because these do not only translate into foreign policy, but there's a whole domestic policy cracking going on. So that, from the European standpoint, is Trump's problem. From the American standpoint, it works in a different way. Since there is pressure, since the old national security Republicans are now raising their head again and in defense of Ukraine, Trump has to move quickly so that this does not become a schism. And he doesn't need that schism, and he's about to face domestic schisms on other affairs like the Epstein file or the SNAP food benefits file. So, and also the ICE in the cities, the immigration police, which is not going down so well. At least it's certainly riling up the Democrats with some success and losing a lot of Hispanic support. So he's got to move quickly so that there are no cracks. And the Europeans more or less know this and say, well, if you want to move quickly, you'll have to move with regard to us. We will also be part of your acceleration. You cannot just throw a solution on our head because you have domestic problems.
Yeah, and Harold, last week, one of the domestic problems was that Bloomberg report that surfaced about Witkoff somehow coaching one of President Putin's advisors on how to sell the plan more effectively to President Trump. I mean, that generated some trust issues in the United States. What sort of an effect do you think it had on Europe and European leaders?
Well, for French leaders, they're accustomed to anything goes in Washington. So it didn't matter to them. They noticed all the way to the presidential palace. They noticed that, but they just brush it off to the press anyway. They're probably a little more worried behind closed doors, but it doesn't matter so much because Witkoff is sort of saying to the Russian side, if you want this to advance, here are the right things you should say to my boss. Okay, it's a very private enterprise, I guess, real estate technique, but it wasn't seen as complete treachery. I didn't get the impression that the French took this to be treachery, like we're double dealing, we're really coaching the Russians to appear like they're negotiating and we already have the result in our pocket. That's not the impression I got. And as for the other Europeans, I didn't see them diverge very much. Friedrich Merz of Germany sometimes deviates a bit. Keir Starmer doesn't really deviate, and no other European is really weighing in. I mean, the President Stubb of Finland is a loyal player in this, but he doesn't have so much weight. So for the moment, it's really what Macron thinks that counts, and his entourage just says whatever they want to do in Washington. We know where we want this to end up, and they may make a mess of the playground. We don't care.
Okay, and just lastly, Harold, to wrap up our conversation, what chance do you think there is of progress this week? I mean, it's being described as a pivotal week. We've got Witkoff heading to Moscow during the course of the week. He's going to hold talks with President Putin. I mean, supposing President Putin doesn't compromise at all, he hasn't shown any signs he's going to up until this point, he sticks to his demands, then what happens?
Well, you have two scenarios. Putin doesn't move or Putin moves a little bit. So generally what he does is he says, I might move, and then he pushes the dates forward in the hope that maybe he will gain more territory. So in the last weeks, he's gained not quite the landmass of New York City with all 5 boroughs. So this is not enough to threaten the Ukrainian defense perimeter around Prokofsk completely, but it's bad. It's very inconvenient. So I think the Russians have not gone this far to simply say nothing. And I think there's a lock-in now. They're in the machinery, they are in the equation, they're in the game. And if they stopped cold, it would show. And they couldn't argue their way out of it. It would definitely be the blame on them. So this, I mean, we can only surmise, but the whole Western camp, Europeans plus the United States plus Turkey, they all pretty much agree on that, is that this is going forward and something must come out of it. And at the worst, in the European view, let's have a ceasefire. And in the American view, which is perhaps more realistic, let's go for an all-out peace in one shot.
Okay, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us and sharing your analysis. Harold Hyman, a journalist in Paris, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to William Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine. He joins us from Kyiv, in fact. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Ambassador. Last time we spoke was about 10 days ago, and it was when the 28-point plan had just surfaced. And you seem to be saying at the time that it sounded like that plan, we seemed slightly incredulous about it, and you said it sounded like it was a plan that had been penned by Russia. What have we learned about that plan in the last 10 days or so?
I think we've learned that it was penned by Russia and then submitted to Steve Witkoff on the American side, who may have made some adjustments. And then, of course, we found out that it leaked, probably from the Russians, because we were having conversations, Tom, about the specifics of that 28-point plan, which, as you say, many people were incredulous about. That is, it was so slanted toward the Russians that many people couldn't believe that this was really a U.S. position. And it turns out it wasn't a U.S. position. So we've learned some things since then.
Right, and President Trump says it's been fine-tuned. I mean, do you think rewritten might be a better characterization?
He says fine-tuned, rewritten is probably a better characterization. And in particular, by Marco Rubio last weekend, where he pulled together Europeans and Ukrainians and got their input into the plan. And that seems to be what was being discussed in Florida yesterday, and I guess will be discussed with the Kremlin in the coming days.
Indeed, Ambassador, and those talks in Florida were described by Secretary of State Rubio as being productive, but he said that tough issues remain to be resolved. I mean, what tough issues do you think there are at this stage?
Clearly, territories is a tough issue. The Ukrainians don't want to give up legal claim to any of their territories. Indeed, they can't. They are not allowed to under their constitution. So they're not going to give up legal claim, de jure claim. They might, Tom, through gritted teeth, be willing to say that, to acknowledge that de jure, in fact, the Russians occupy 19% of their territory. They're not going to give up claim to that 19%, but they may acknowledge that the Russians are there temporarily, and they will try to get that back. That's one of the big issues. I imagine security guarantee is an important one, and the role of Europeans in that, and in that security guarantee. And I think that's not an issue for the Russians. The Russians don't get a say about security guarantee, to include the Russians don't get a say about Ukraine's joining NATO at some point. So I think those are going to be interesting conversations between the Americans and the Ukrainians, and then soon the Europeans.
One comment I read was from Senator Mitch McConnell. And, you know, he's one of a number of people who've been somewhat critical of the approach to this issue. He said, a deal that rewards aggression wouldn't be worth the paper it's written on. America isn't a neutral arbiter, and we shouldn't act like one. Do you think there is an impression, and do you think perhaps the Europeans are seeing this as well, that the United States is trying to come across as being something of a neutral arbiter? And in fact, it isn't, is it?
It's not. It is not. One nation invaded another. That's very clear to us, very clear to the Europeans, very clear to the Ukrainians. It's clear to the Russians. So no, you cannot be neutral in that crime. That's a crime. And not to mention war crimes in association with that invasion. So yes, you cannot be neutral. Someone made the point that Neville Chamberlain did not get a peace prize for his actions. You're not rewarded by appeasement.
Right, and another comment I picked out, and I wanted to ask you about that, came from Representative Mike Turner of Ohio, another Republican, who's concerned about the Russian plan being too the plan being too pro-Russian, and he said that you can't be America first and pro-Russian because, he said, Russia is a self-declared adversary of the United States. Are you getting the impression that this issue is starting to do some domestic damage to President Trump?
I think it is clear that the majority of Americans, and probably the majority of Republicans within the majority of Americans, support Ukraine and oppose Russia. And they recognize what you and I just talked about, and that is the Russians are the aggressor. And the Ukrainians are trying to defend themselves. And so I think that is a widespread understanding among American people. As you've reported, there are 85 senators out of 100 who are supporting a big sanctions bill on Russia in support of Ukraine. So, yeah, I think the politics are clear.
Okay, and another thing that's happened since we last spoke was that leak by Bloomberg was published about how Witkoff had been coaching one of President Putin's advisors. That was very much downplayed by both Washington and Moscow. Was it a non-issue for you as well?
No, I think it was an issue. I think it demonstrated the attitude of Steve Witkoff, basically in support of the Russians, which is not America first, as the congressman said. That leak also showed that Witkoff prompted Mr. Putin to disrupt, indeed sabotage, a meeting that the United States, that President Trump was planning to have with President Zelenskyy. So this was not pro-America.
Right, and we're about to have this week the 6th face-to-face meeting between Steve Witkoff and President Putin. Some people think their rapport is a little on the cozy side. I mean, does that worry you?
It does. It does. Again, as we've just talked about, we're not neutral on the United States is not neutral. Steve Witkoff is more than not neutral. He's pro-Russian, it seems. When he talks to Putin, as you say, he's been there many times. He comes back and gives the Russian line, quotes President Putin, thinks President Putin's a fine guy, despite the fact he's an indicted war criminal. So I do worry.
And you're in Ukraine itself, and I would like to ask you what morale is like at the moment, because of course it's been a difficult time for Ukraine, not least the fact that they've been invaded. But I'm talking about in the past couple of days, there's been loss of ground on the battlefield, this ongoing corruption scandal, which has seen Zelensky's chief of staff have to resign. I mean, how much do you think all of that weakens Ukraine's hand at the negotiating table?
You know, in some sense, Tom, it actually increases the resolve of the Ukrainians. Yes, the Ukrainians are under pressure. When they're under pressure, they stiffen. They're stronger. President Zelenskyy is probably a little bit better off now than he was. Yes, he's lost a competent but controversial advisor, chief of staff. He has the opportunity now to put in some new people who may get along better with foreigners and may get along better with Ukrainians. Mr. Yermak was, as I say, competent but controversial. And so this may help him. And this corruption crisis, as you say, is also having the effect of demonstrating that there are some serious anti-corruption measures being taken by the Ukrainians.
Right, so you don't think it's purely mileage that can be used by the Russians?
The Russians will clearly use it. Absolutely they will, and are. But the Ukrainians understand, and I think Europeans, and I think Americans understand what the Russian game is. And there's support, as I say, as we talked about just a minute ago, support from United States people, Senate, House, and from this administration. For the Ukrainians to stand up to the Russians, stop the Russians now before they get to the border of Poland.
Some comments that were made by NATO's most senior military officer, Giuseppe Cavo-Dragone. I don't know if you saw his comments, but he said that under some circumstances, a preemptive strike on Moscow could be considered as an, and it's obviously something that has caused a lot of anger in Moscow. I don't know if you saw those comments, but what do you think he's got in mind here?
I saw a version of his comments. I didn't hear him say preemptive strike on Moscow. I heard him saying take proactive, even preemptive measures that might imply a willingness to shoot down some drones or even Russian aircraft if they were headed towards NATO airspace. That would be preemptive. Before they got into NATO airspace, that is over Ukrainian territory, NATO might shoot them down if they were threatening to come into NATO airspace. That was what I took from his comments, not a preemptive strike on Moscow.
Okay, and just lastly, we've heard President Zelenskyy talking about bringing the war to a dignified end. I think those were his words. Knowing as you do the country you're in, Ukraine, what do you think a dignified end would mean for a Ukrainian?
A dignified end, I think, Tom, will be a sovereign Ukraine, an independent Ukraine, an independent Ukraine that is recognized in its internationally recognized borders, even if it's also recognized that the Russians temporarily are occupying part of their country. That would be a dignified. Marco Rubio mentioned something like that yesterday. A sovereign, independent, democratic, economically prosperous Ukraine, that would be a dignified end.
Okay, William Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir. Let's get more now. We can speak to... Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.